Is a forest a place of silence? Or is it a recording studio for the screams of the dying? We usually define a plant by its hunger for light, a silent green machine that eats the sun. But the withered, fleshy frond pressed between the glass slides of this vacuum chamber suggests an evolution driven not by photons, but by phonetics. This is a cutting of the Siren-Flora, the dominant vegetation of the now silenced Sector 11. Let us break the seal on the containment unit and document what remains. At first glance, specimen 9 Theta resembles a large terrestrial fern, specifically of the genus Polystichum. It possesses a central rachis and pinnate leaflets arranged in a symmetrical pattern. However, the color is wrong. It is not green, it is a bruised, translucent violet, fading to the pale pink of mucosal tissue. Spectrographic analysis confirms the total absence of chlorophyll. This organism had no interest in the sun. It grew in the perpetual twilight of the deep under canopy, and it fed on something far more substantial than solar radiation. Touch, conducted via remote waldas to avoid biological contamination, reveals a texture that is repulsive to the mammalian instinct. The leaves are not fibrous or rigid with cellulose, they are cartilaginous. They possess the damp, elastic give of a throat lining. When we apply a mild electrostatic charge to the stem to simulate bioactivity, the entire frond contracts. It does not wilt, it gags. Reference the cross-section on monitor 2. The internal structure of the central stem is hollow, lined with ridges of taut, fibrous tissue. Standard botany would identify these as xylem and phloem for water transport. However, fluid dynamics testing reveals they are pneumatic. These are not veins, they are vocal cords. The plant is a biological bellows. It is designed to pump gas through these restricted chambers to modulate frequency. The surface of the leaf itself acts as a dual-function acoustic membrane, both a microphone and a speaker. It is covered in millions of microscopic cilia, hair cells functionally identical to those found in the human cochlea. These cells are incredibly sensitive to air pressure changes, capable of capturing sound waves with high fidelity. But unlike an ear, which sends the signal to a brain for processing, the Siren-Flora sends the signal to a chemical storage matrix in the root system. It remembers the sound physically, etching the waveform into its own cellular structure. We recovered this specimen from the weeping jungle, a biome that initial survey drones classified as having the highest biodiversity density in the sector. The drones were deceived. The audio sensors picked up the calls of thousands of bird species, the chittering of insects, and the roar of primates. But when the ground team arrived, they found the forest floor empty. There were no birds. There were no monkeys. There were only these plants, swaying in the wind, broadcasting the stolen sounds of creatures they had consumed centuries ago. I find the evolutionary trajectory here profoundly disturbing. In nature, mimicry is usually visual, a stick insect looking like a twig to avoid predation. Here, the mimicry is auditory and aggressive. The plant has evolved to become a perfect echo chamber. It does not just copy noise, it curates it. The analysis of the chemical residue on the lips of the leaves, the serrated edges, reveals a sticky, neuroparalytic enzyme. This suggests that the frond is not just a passive listener. It is a lure. It is a biological tape recorder designed to play back the specific sounds that trigger curiosity. Or more cruelly, compassion. We must now descend from the canopy of the leaf to the root of the behavior. To understand the weeping jungle, one must understand that in this ecosystem, sound is not a method of communication, it is a weapon of entrapment. The Siren-Flora does not photosynthesize, it hunts. And its primary hunting adaptation is the weaponization of empathy. Beneath the swaying, violet fronds lies the digestion pit. It is a subterranean cavity masked by a weave of fragile, moss-like webbing. In a standard pitcher plant, the lure is nectar, a chemical bribe. Here, the lure is a narrative. The plant engages in a behavior we have termed acoustic ventriloquism. By vibrating the pneumatic chambers in its stem, it can project sound with terrifying directional precision. It does not emit the sound from the leaf itself. It projects the audio to a point roughly 3 meters behind the plant, directly over the concealed pit. Consider the experience of a predator or a scavenger navigating this twilight world. It hears a sound. It is not the roar of a threat. It is the whimper of the vulnerable. It hears the high-pitched bleating of a fractured leg, or the distressed chirping of an abandoned nestling. The sound triggers a primal response, either the hunger for an easy kill, or, in more complex social species, the instinct to protect. The victim approaches the sound. It pushes through the curtain of violet leaves, looking for the wounded animal. It steps onto the moss. The ground gives way. The victim falls into the root maw, a chamber filled not with acid, but with a highly viscous, neuroparalytic mucilage. The digestion is slow, agonizingly slow. And this is the cruelty of the design. The plant does not want the victim to die quickly. A dead thing makes no noise. The Siren-Flora requires the victim to remain alive, conscious, and vocal for as long as possible. Why? Because the plant is recording. We have managed to perform an audio forensic reconstruction on the cellular structure of reference frond 4. By scanning the microscopic undulations of the leaf's waxy cuticle with a laser interferometer, we can essentially play the plant like a vinyl record. We can hear what this specific organism heard during its life cycle. The playback is an archive of horrors. The initial tracks are standard ecological background noise, rainfall, thunder, the wind, but then, we hear the capture events. We hear the sudden snap of the pit cover breaking. We hear the splash of the mucilage. And then, we hear the screams. The plant records the distress calls of its prey with high-fidelity perfection. But it does not just replay them raw. The analysis of the waveform shows evidence of bioediting. The plant physically edits the audio loop. It cuts out the silence. It removes the low-frequency groans of exhaustion and isolates the high-frequency spikes of acute pain, the sounds most likely to travel far in dense foliage. It creates a greatest hits compilation of suffering. The most disturbing discovery, however, came when we analyzed the frequency bands normally reserved for sentience. The Weeping Jungle was the site of the failed colonial survey expedition of Cycle 7. The expedition vanished without a trace. No bodies were ever recovered. When we played back the audio data from a mature Siren-Flora located near the coordinates of their last transmission, we did not hear animals. We heard Commander Holloway. The recording was crystal clear. It was a loop of his voice, shouting, "Help me, I'm down here, my leg is broken, please, someone." The tone was not one of dying, it was one of urgent, hopeful distress. The plant had captured the precise moment of his entrapment. But then, the recording shifted. We heard a second voice, Medic Aris, responding to the call. "Hold on, Commander, I'm coming." Then, the sound of snapping branches. A second splash. A second scream. The plant had used the commander's voice to trap the medic. And then, it began to use the medic's voice. We can hypothesize that within a week, the entire expedition had been consumed, cascading into the pits one by one, lured by the voices of their friends. This implies a level of recursive predation that is almost impossible to defend against. The flora turns the greatest strength of a social species, their loyalty, into their fatal flaw. The more you care about your pack, the faster you go extinct in the Weeping Jungle. We also found evidence that the plants network this audio. The root systems of the Siren-Flora are interconnected via fungal mycelium. It appears they can transfer data. If a plant in Sector A captures a new, interesting sound, like the cry of a human child, it can transmit that waveform to a plant in Sector B. The entire forest updates its playlist. We observed this in the lab, when we exposed the cutting to a recording of a generic distress beat. The leaf vibrated in sympathy, attempting to learn the syntax. It is a learning machine. It is constantly expanding its vocabulary of misery. The cultural artifacts found near the jungle edge, the silent totems of the indigenous tribes, now make perfect sense. They are statues of figures with their hands clamped firmly over their ears. The local populations knew the truth. They knew that in the Weeping Jungle, if you hear someone screaming for help, you must run in the opposite direction. To listen is to be digested. The extinction of the Weeping Jungle was not a biological failure, it was an acoustic singularity. The ecosystem died from the Larsen effect, the physical phenomenon of audio feedback. As the Siren-Flora proved to be the apex predator, it propagated without check. The density of the foliage increased until the forest was no longer a collection of individual hunters, but a solid wall of acoustic membranes. The distance between plants shrank to zero, and this proximity triggered the collapse. It began, we hypothesize, with a single trigger event, perhaps a thunderstorm, or the death cry of a large megafauna. One plant recorded the sound and played it back. The neighboring plant, detecting a high-fidelity signal, recorded that playback and amplified it. The first plant then recorded the amplification. The jungle entered an infinite, recursive loop. Instead of the targeted, deceptive mimicry of specific prey, the forest descended into a chaotic, escalating screech. The feedback loop grew exponentially louder with every iteration. The audio logs from the final days of the sector, recorded by orbital satellites, show that the decibel level within the canopy exceeded the threshold of pain for biological life. It reached the volume of a jet engine, sustained continuously for weeks. The cacophony collapse destroyed the food web. The volume was so intense that it physically ruptured the eardrums of any animal that approached the perimeter. The delicate, psychological lure was replaced by a sonic wall of white noise. Animals did not walk into the traps, they fled in terror. The birds stopped flying over the sector. The insects were vibrated to death in the air. The Siren-Flora had become too efficient. By screaming too loudly, they deafened their dinner. The starvation was total. Without new biomass entering the digestion pits, the plants began to consume their own reserves. The violet fronds withered, turning the gray of old ash. The pneumatic pressure in the stems failed. One by one, the voices of the forest flickered out. The screaming stopped, not because the anger was gone, but because the batteries died. The weeping jungle today is a silent zone. It is a graveyard of starved biological tape recorders. The plants are still there, dormant, waiting for a drop of water and a single sound to restart the cycle.